Well, hello, everybody. Manchester Hooks at Auburn. This is the first Wednesday of the month of June 2018, which means I have the great privilege and pleasure of welcoming back, as we do the first Wednesday of every month, my good friend, the Dean of the Senate, Lou D'Alessandro, now the subject of a hot selling. Can we say that?
Well, I think it's moving up. We just had former ambassador to the United States, the United Nations, Bill Richardson. He just bought 20 books.
He did?
He did.
What's he want 20 books for?
Well, he wants to do something for us in New Mexico. So
New Mexico.
So we're very pleased with that.
Well,
Thank you,
I'll be going to
Richardson.
meet my sister, who's from New Mexico, and going
that's
to be
great.
meeting her in
Right.
Texas tomorrow. So
Good.
Yeah.
I guess I better get a book to give her
Maybe
too.
Bill's.
Well, I wish Richardson was on his way to the Far East to be a participant in this meeting between the president and
Oh yeah,
the head of North Korea.
he would be a big mistake not to get his expertise
He's a
on
guy
this.
with great experience. Instead, they're going to settle for Dennis Rodman. So I think we're in deep
Really?
trouble. We're in deep trouble. Well, Rodman's going to be there.
Is that right?
Yes, and he's had more access to the North Korean dictator than almost any other American.
Well, that's true.
Yeah. So, Arnie, how about that?
Well, it's interesting, Lou. Let me just say that the American Friends Service Committee is one of the few non-governmental organizations that has been doing humanitarian work in North Korea now for many years. It's a
No
very
kidding.
unusual position
Yeah.
that we're in.
How many people you got there?
I don't know exactly how it works. It's very challenging, very sensitive work. Not very. I mean, we're not. It's not a secret.
Yeah.
But it's also not work that generates a lot of publicity. But
Well,
it's been
probably
about
for good
working
reason.
with
Yeah.
working with North Korean farmers and helping them to be able to raise food and feed themselves, as I understand it.
Well,
Wow.
So it's an interesting thing that, again, the work of the American Friends Service Committee, which is now more than 100 years of work, we really try to not pay attention to, in a sense, what side. If people are hungry,
Feed 'em.
we're concerned about helping them get fed, regardless of what are the policies of their government and their government's relationship with our government.
Well, how about that?
Talk about a
So,
worthy
Lou,
cause.
I was about to introduce our guest,
guest.
but he's
Here I am.
already on the air.
Right.
One of my favorite people in the great state of New Hampshire, Arnie Alpert, who has for many, many years been a leader of the American Friends Service Committee, a Quaker activist organization that is on the forefront of so many campaigns to bring equity and justice and economic improvement to the disadvantage of our citizens. And Arnie, you've been,
Great,
how
thanks.
many years you been doing this?
Well, I'll turn, I'll turn 37 in August.
And I'm turning 39 shortly thereafter,
Something
right?
like that. That's what I know. So, no, I started at the AFSC in August of 1981.
My
So
goodness,
yeah, a long time.
long time.
Long time.
And there's no
Back
finer
when-
organization than
back when
AFSC.
Senator D'Alessandro was being called Liberal Lou.
Liberal
Right,
Lou, and he was a
right,
Republican,
right.
as I love to
Right.
remind him.
Yes,
That's
yes. When I was
And his book, if you haven't read it, it's
Yeah.
it's really fun to read, and you'll learn a lot about it.
Yeah.
But in any event, I wanted to take just a minute before we get into the things that Arnie is here for, which is to deal with the Poor People's Campaign, and that's acknowledging the legacy of one of our all-time greatest Americans ever, Martin Luther King. And we're going to talk about Martin Luther King, whose tragic death is just over 50 years ago. But I thought we should say a little bit about the date we are celebrating today, June 6th, 2018. First and least important, today, June 6th, is the first day you can file for public office in New Hampshire. And a lot of folks did, including me. I went down to the city clerk's office. If you're running for the state house, that's where you go. Any other office in these elections, you have to go to the Secretary of State's office. And that's where Senator Lou is going to go tomorrow. And he's
Yes.
going to file for his election for the 10th time?
my 11th term. In the
11th?
Senate. Right? 11 terms in the
11
Senate.
terms.
Hopefully.
So that's a kind of a big thing, but it pales in consequence to some of the other things that happened on June 6th.
Yes.
And I
that's
just
true.
want to mention both of them. First of all, June 6, 1944 was an enormous date in American history. It was the invasion of Normandy.
Yes.
And we celebrate that every year, and very appropriately. Many heroic Americans faced a continent of enemies there. But I also just would like to do a little historical corrective. when we hear about June 6th and we celebrate the heroes at Normandy, and they certainly were heroes and deserve everything, we tend to claim that this was the liberation of Europe.
Far from
Well,
it.
you know, not so much.
Right. Oh, yeah.
The Red Army, Joseph Stalin's Red Army, had been pushing the Germans back for a year and a half by the time we invaded the beaches at Normandy. A year and a half. And it's always interested me, because we sometimes lament that the Russians don't send a top person like their prime minister to the Normandy celebrations. I don't think we've ever sent an American to celebrate the Russian victory at Stalingrad, which started in the fall of 1942 and ended with the surrender of the remnants of the 600,000 Germans that were in that city in January of 1943. And from that date until the invasion of Normandy, the Red Army was never in retreat. It was advancing and advancing and advancing. And 8 out of every 10 German casualties was incurred on the Eastern Front, not on the Western Front. I just want to put it in perspective, folks, because as much as we properly celebrate D-Day as a great triumph for democracy and an important event in American history, we don't give sufficient credit to the Red Army, which, you know, was working for a dreadful dictator that nobody misses, nobody should miss.
Right.
But they were the main implement in defeating the Nazis. And I just put that out there. If you want to argue me about this, you can, but those are the facts, folks. And I want to move on from that, because the other thing that happened today, 50 years ago, was the death of Robert F. Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, who had been shot the day before, June 5th, at the Ambassador Hotel after having just won the California primary. And I think that feeds into what we're going to talk with Arnie about, because I consider Bobby Kennedy, he was a flawed person. He wasn't a perfect person, as neither was his brother, JFK. But they were people who made enormous and beneficial changes for our country. And I think that RFK, Bobby Kennedy, was in a position to carry forward in a political way some of the agenda that was being advanced by that great American, Martin Luther King, who died in April of 1968. And at the time he died, he had moved on from being a campaigner for civil rights. And we all remember what he did in Selma, the letter from jail in Selma, and the March on Washington in August of 1963. We all remember that. But we should remember that as he died, his last major great campaign was to be a voice for the poor people of America, to lead a poor people's march, to lead wagon trains, with mules and call attention to the fact that we have not achieved the most perfect union yet. The Constitution says we are formed to achieve a more perfect union. And we have a long way to go to make that more perfect union a perfect union, a long way. And Martin Luther King was working on that. And, Arnie, I'm now going to let you introduce yourself a little more, because I consider you one of the people to be in the succession to have us form this more perfect union.
Thanks, Bob. Thanks. It's good to be with you on the show again. But it's like, if you think about it, it's one of the reasons, probably the major reason why it was so important for us to take as long as it did, which was 20 years, to establish a holiday named for Dr. King here in New Hampshire.
Yes.
And it wasn't just because of what Dr. King stood for during his life, or because we want to recognize the importance of history. That's very true. But if we look at what Dr. King stood for, those values and those issues and the way he went about change are just as important for us now as they were during his lifetime. Yeah. So if we look at the challenges that he identified, the evil of systemic poverty, the evil of systemic racism, the evil of militarism, which he called the triple evils that said we're interconnected with each other and we have to go after all of them and understand their relationship, those are still with us. Mm-hmm. And that's really what underlies the inspiration to reignite the Poor People's Campaign in 2018 on the 50th anniversary of the Poor People's Campaign initiated by Dr. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference.
Well, I just think it's remarkable and wonderful that this legacy is not forgotten, that it's living today with the revival of this campaign.
Yeah.
But tell us a little bit about yourself before we get into that.
Well, what do you want to know, Bob? I'm not going to like start with my birth and where I went
Well, you
to
could tell-
school,
you could tell us
I
what
can- I can
you've
say,
been doing, how
I will
long.
tell you, Bob, that this is something of interest, at least to you, that my very first trip to Concord, New Hampshire, was as a guest of former Governor Meldrum Thompson, who had me and 1,414 others arrested while occupying the Seabrook nuclear power plant in 1977, and
I
I
was
was
there.
one of a couple hundred
You were there?
people.
Well, I was on the executive council at the time, and I could remember that Bob Whalen was our commissioner of what was then Health and Human Services, Health and Welfare in those days. And I remember the roundup. I remember the climbing of the fence, and
Well,
I'll tell you what a time.
Interesting. Lou,
Yeah.
back in '77, there was no fence. We just walked down the
Yeah,
road
right, yeah.
onto the site, which was basically a big parking lot for
Oh,
the
yeah.
construction workers,
Right.
and we pitched our tents.
Yeah.
And the next day, Mel called in the police, not just from New Hampshire, but from all the other New
Everywhere,
England states, because they
everywhere, yeah.
needed them all to round us up.
did, yeah.
And I was a group of, I don't know, 150 or 200 people held in the National Guard
Guard
Armory
Armory,
in
right,
Concord
right.
for the next 13 days
Right.
Yeah.
until our attorneys arranged for us to be released without a trial. We all had to plead guilty, or we all agreed to be found guilty without trial and to be automatically allowed to appeal our cases to Superior Court.
Right.
Thinking that this seemed like a kangaroo court, I fashioned a kangaroo outfit. I sewed a little pouch onto my shirt and made a little sock puppet and stuffed it in, and I hopped into the Hampton District Court.
Yeah. You know,
Judge
it-
Whitey
so-
Fraser, wasn't he the presiding judge at that time?
Judge, no, it wasn't.
no.
It
Ed
was,
McDermott?
Arthur.
Well,
I don't remember.
Yeah,
Never
okay.
mind.
We'll think of it later. That's
but-
trivia.
yeah.
That's
I-
trivia.
I-
But
Sure.
what's important about that, Bob,
Was
though,
the
and Luke,
event.
is that the movement that happened there at Seabrook, again, it showed the power of the people through active nonviolence, organized, disciplined, to stand up against the power of big money and big politics.
Yeah.
And a federal government that was rigging the process on behalf of the powerful against people who had other ideas, and that we were able to make change in this country.
Yeah.
And that's a lesson that never left me, obviously inspired by examples like Dr. King that come before.
Yeah.
And then that then inspires and models other things that have
Yeah.
happened since then. And that's what something that I've been
And,
certainly
and
part
I
of.
would like to make
Yeah.
a little confession right
Yeah.
here now. As you know, Arnie, at that time I was a lawyer fighting the Seabrook nuke for some citizens groups,
Yeah.
the Seacoast Anti-Pollution League principally, which still exists. And to this day, I regret I wasn't among the arrestees. I have to say, I
It's-
thought that would be inappropriate for me as the
Well,
lawyer.
I think so. You know,
But I'm so sorry that in a way I did not participate in that.
So-
Because that was the biggest act of civil disobedience since the Vietnam War.
that's right.
And talk about the law of unintended consequences. Meldrum Thompson thought he was showing you all a lesson. And what he formed was an incredibly cohesive and powerful organization
That's right.
that bonded in these
spent-
these armories.
We spent 13 days learning from each other.
Yeah.
How about that? Talk about building community. So that was,
Yeah.
again, that was part of that. And this
That
is
was a
this
big
is
part
one
of
of the
New
ways that
Hampshire's history.
nonviolence works, Bob, is
Yeah.
that when the state or others, the forces that you're up against, use high levels of force or power against you, it makes them look bad. And if they don't do that, you get what you want, and you can move forward. And, you can,
And if
we can look
anybody
at-
understood that,
Yeah.
it was certainly Martin Luther King and perhaps Mahatma Gandhi too. He's understood it in India.
and that's right, and that's who we learned from.
And Arnie, I have to ask you, you told me, and I didn't realize this. I knew we were very late to recognize Martin Luther King with a national holiday, but you told me we were in fact the last state.
We were the 50th state in the country
Yeah, right.
to
Sure.
adopt
Why-
a holiday
why
named for
why
Dr.
was
Martin
that?
Luther King.
Why would
It
not?
started
I mean-
with Jim Splain introducing a bill in the state Senate in 1979 when he was a young senator. It took until 1999
Right.
to get it through every session. It was introduced and defeated, basically, up until that time.
Well,
And it finally went through.
Got to give credit to Jean Shaheen for pushing it. I think she
Well,
she worked hard.
She worked hard at it on the end, Lou, but
Yes.
the 2 years before that, it failed by one vote.
Yeah.
And if I want to be honest, if Governor Shaheen had done a little bit more
Right,
that
right.
year,
Maybe,
it would have prevailed.
Yeah. Well, Arnie, failing by one vote, I've had a few things fail by one
I know
vote.
that.
So I
I know what you're thinking about.
There's nothing more
But anyway,
devastating.
she did
yeah,
support. It was very
yes.
important. When she came back that next year,
Right.
she made it a priority. It was
Yes.
in her State of the State speech,
yeah, sure.
and she worked it. And we had a great celebration on
Yep,
the
we
State
did.
House lawn that
Yeah,
she
we did. I remember that
she
well.
hosted. We had Martin Luther King III
He
came
showed
up as
up.
part of that.
Right.
And let's give
so
some
yeah.
credit where I don't usually want to give it to a Republican. Wasn't Steve Merrill?
No,
He was not supportive of this?
no, Steve Merrill was not supportive of
I don't
this.
recall
I'm
that.
Not at
wrong
all.
about that.
Yeah,
Then.
yeah.
I thought he
No,
was.
Steve Merrill, in fact, made a statement at one point saying that we don't have a problem with racism in New Hampshire, and we never did. So that was Steve Merrill's attitude.
Oh my goodness.
So, and this is a man, as I was sort of thinking about pictures that I've seen of the historical photos of the Ku Klux Klan marching down the beach in Hampton Beach, in the town of Hampton, where former Governor Merrill grew up. That if we don't acknowledge our history here, we don't acknowledge that New Hampshire was a slave state up until the middle of the 1800s, that we don't acknowledge that New Hampshire had a thriving Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s, if we don't acknowledge that our grand hotels in the White Mountains had signs that said no Negroes, Jews, or dogs, if we don't acknowledge that William Loeb, the publisher of the Manchester Union Leader, was a defender of Jim Crow segregation and was an ally of the movement that was trying to stop the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That's part of our history, too.
I'll never forget his editorial on the day of Martin Luther King's assassination. It was titled, "He Reaped the Whirlwind."
Yeah.
He reaped the whirlwind.
Yeah.
Well, Arnie, that's a distressing part of our history, and I hope we're getting past that.
Right. But we always, and this is our country's history, we always have those unfortunate and evil forces at work, but we always have forces trying
Fighting
to
against
expand
it,
democracy, trying to protect and promote human rights,
Yeah.
and expand the notion when we talk about a more perfect union.
Right.
We
A more
always have
perfect
those
union.
forces that are trying to do that. And that's, I think, what the Poor People's Campaign represents now.
Oh, sure. And I think, Ernie, the catalyst for the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act were the activities that took place during that time period.
Oh.
And, we're now seeing a lot of things about Lyndon Johnson, here and there, negative stuff that's coming out. But I must say this, and I've talked to historians about this. Nobody could have done it. Nobody but Lyndon Johnson could have done it. He had the political acumen to make it happen.
Yeah.
And many people obviously lost their seats. Al Gore Sr. lost his seat in the Senate by virtue of his vote. But when you think of it, and I've been in politics in New Hampshire a long time, clearly we had more negative items in place to avoid allowing people to vote than almost any state. And people don't realize this, that for years we were under look-see by the federal government
That's
because
right.
because of our
That's
voting
right.
practices. For years.
time, that's
for a
right.
long time. Maybe we've been released at this time, I think.
Well, we're released because the U.S. Supreme Court has invalidated those parts of the Voting Rights Act. And that is one of the goals of the Poor People's Campaign, is to reenact a powerful Voting Rights Act in this country. Because for the last several years, what we've been seeing is voting rights being rolled back in
well,
state
no
after
question.
state, including New Hampshire,
Yep.
as
Well,
you
there's
know.
no- there's no
We are
question.
fighting voter suppression all the
Oh,
time here, aren't we?
absolutely.
It's
but
just terrible.
So,
but those events in the history of the United States are glossed over in our schools. We don't spend enough time talking about it and talking about civil rights and the right to participate. You know, and I was a civics teacher at Kennett High School in Conway many years ago. That's where I started out, taught civics. And Ernie, it took me a long time, I don't want to say 20 years, but damn close to it, to get a bill passed where we'd teach civics in all of our schools. We just got that done in the last session. And how important these things are. And we sort of gloss over some things, and your signs clearly indicate the things we do gloss over. We don't recognize real poverty. We don't recognize these things that are omnipresent in our society. I think just this week in Manchester, we took the people living by the river, all right, who were the homeless people living by the river, and moved them out. That's a tough thing. I empathize with the police officers who have to do that because they have empathy for the people. On the other side, I say, geez, what are we doing
Where are they
to
gonna
make
go?
their lives
Yeah.
better?
Yeah.
You know,
Why is it that in the richest state in the richest
One
country
of
in
the
the
richest,
world,
yeah,
and one of the
yeah.
richest states in the country, that we can't come up with the resources that we need to make sure that people have a roof over their head?
Yeah.
Right?
I
And that's-
think,
and that's
yeah.
it's terrible.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's not just Manchester; it's Concord, and
Oh,
it's all
yeah.
over the state. You
It's-
look at the failure of the state to come up with money for affordable housing.
Yes.
Less than Maine, less than Vermont, less than Massachusetts.
Yeah.
You did just come up with a couple $1 million in,
Yeah,
in this
2.5.
sort of additional
Yes,
budget,
right,
so that's
right.
good, but it still is a drop in the bucket
Oh, sure.
if you look at what the state needs. And again, that's one of the issues that we'll be lifting up next Monday at the Poor People's Campaign rally in Concord, 2 p.m. In front of the State House. We'll be
Right.
talking about ending homelessness and about promoting affordable housing under the theme,
Yeah.
everybody's got a right to live. And that doesn't just mean you've got a right to survive, it means you've got a right to live with dignity. You've got a right to health care. You've got a right to nutrition. You've got a right to secure housing. You've got a right to a living wage job, and you've got a right to secure retirement. And we've got to lift that up and say, this is what we stand for as a state and as a nation.
As his banner says right in front of him here, everybody's got a right to live.
Yeah.
And
That was
I-
actually a song that was, I forget the man's name, but he wrote it. He was part of the Poor People's Campaign in the Resurrection City in Washington 50 years ago and had this
Oh,
song. I'm
really?
not going to sing it for you, and I'm not going to ask you to sing. But,
Well, that's a
but,
blessing for our viewers.
but that's actually where that theme comes from. It comes from the song. So you can Google that. Everybody's got a right to live, and you'll come up with the song. And we'll be singing that as well
We have
at the
some
State
great
House
songs.
on
We
Monday.
have some great protest
So-
songs. Folks, I think this may be a good time to take a quick break, and we'll be right back. We have Arnie Alpert with us, and of course Lou D'Alessandro, my good friend, is with me, and delighted to have him here. And we will take your calls. If you want to call in, 640-3091. If you want to call in and participate, we'd love to have you do that. Whatever point of view you want is fine with us. We'll try and fit you in as quickly as we can. And then we want to come back and talk about how Martin Luther King's last campaign, which was a Poor People's Campaign, has been revived in New Hampshire, and I'm sure not just New Hampshire, and what's happening. That's what we'd like to talk about next. So we'll be right back. So this is the progress report for this Wednesday, the first Wednesday in June, June 6th. And we're going to talk about the Poor People's Campaign, a legacy of the great American martyr and leader, Martin Luther King Jr., who died just over 50 years ago in April of 1968. And as he was, at that time, he was in the midst of leading his last great effort, which was beyond just the civil rights for people of color, but to raise up people of poverty around this country and the richest country in the world. Why should we have poor people struggling to put food on the table and to meet their needs in other areas? And that was a legacy that, thought maybe would have died with Martin Luther King as a result of an assassin's bullet. But very, very exciting, and pleased to be able to say it has not died. That dream has not died, nor I think about Martin Luther King's other dreams. And we have a wonderful advocate to talk about the legacy and what happened 50 years ago and what's come up to be the program for today and the effort today, and that's Arnie Alpert, the co-director of the American Friends Service Committee project here in New Hampshire, as he's been a wonderful person to advance our better selves in our public life for a long time. So you go take it over, Arnie, and talk about what happened 50 years ago.
Let's go back to 50 years ago or
Yes.
51 years ago. So the Civil Rights Act is passed, the Voting Rights Act is passed.
Right.
Dr. King is trying to give attention to issues of poverty and discrimination nationwide, understanding that even the passage of those monumental achievements is not enough to bring about genuine equality and justice, particularly because of the way the economy is structured. So he goes to Chicago and tries to lead a campaign to end discriminatory housing patterns and ends up against the power of Mayor Daley. He tries things in other places. He is being challenged by people who are starting to believe that nonviolence does not have the clout that it once did. So other ideologies are stepping forward. The war in Vietnam is going on,
Yes.
robbing the country of the resources that it needs to end poverty, subjecting people of color in particular to greater risks in the war. And Dr. King says we need to step forward, for one thing, to demonstrate that nonviolence still can prevail, and to be able to say we need to be looking at uniting people across racial and ethnic lines, black people, white people, Latino people, Puerto Ricans, others, wherever they're from, all over the country, to say we need a vision of ending poverty in America, and we need to unleash the power of nonviolence in the heart of the nation's capital to push Congress to be willing to do what is needed to put the resources into play to end poverty in this country. And that was the vision of the Poor People's Campaign. And some people weren't even, people who were close to King weren't sure about it.
Yeah.
He had the vision. And this is the thing that I think people don't quite get.
Because
is-
we'd
is
had the
see
war on
King-
poverty from the Johnson
Well,
administration.
but again, so what was happening to the war on poverty? The war on poverty had become a victim of the war on Vietnam.
Yes.
Exactly.
Right.
And King was
Couldn't-
one
we
of the
couldn't
people
afford
who
to do both.
realized that
Right.
and who named it. And when King named that unleashed greater hostility against him because he was willing to tell the truth. And he said, you can call me a civil rights leader. And he said, but first and foremost, I'm a Christian pastor, and I'm going to preach about love, and I'm going to preach about peace. That's what I'm supposed to do.
Right.
And if this is what's going on, then I'm going to have to tell the truth about it. And he did that, and he was blasted for it. But and it wasn't just until then. A lot of people make a lot of a speech he gave a year before he died, April 4th, 1967. He gave a fabulous speech at Riverside Church in New York. And it's called A Time to Break the Silence. And you should go back and read that because, again, he talks specifically about Vietnam, but he talks and why he has found it necessary to come out so strongly against it. But he gets prophetic. He talks about the country. He talks about where do we stand as a country in a time of revolution and he calls for a revolution of values. He says that's what we need. And you can go back and read that, and it just like it was written or spoken yesterday
Yes,
or
right,
today
right,
to do that. But that was not the first time that he talked about the triple evils of racism, poverty or economic exploitation, and militarism and the war economy. So that's why we're trying to, and those interrelated evils have not gone away, and in some ways they perhaps have gotten more entrenched, and now they're
I think they've
exacerbated
got more
even
entrenched and more
Yeah.
bigger. I'm afraid they're
Well,
bigger now. I mean, the percentage of the national wealth that we devote to the military is
More
way
than-
bigger than it was then, isn't
More
it?
than 50% of the discretionary budget that Congress votes on every year goes to military programs.
Yeah.
And much of that goes, frankly, to companies that build weapons. And then they take the money that they make and they turn around and invest in lobbyists and campaign contributions to
get
keep
more.
those wheels turning.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
that's the system. Now, of course, the current
And one of the
president.
byproducts will
Yeah.
become the arms dealer to the
Yeah.
world.
Well, we're also,
Yeah.
so in addition to
Yeah.
having by far the largest military force in the world, we're also by a good stretch the largest seller of weapons in
Yeah.
the world on the global arms market, and that includes companies right here in New Hampshire. It includes gun manufacturers like Sig Sauer, which is the major supplier of firearms to the government of Mexico, where their security forces are interlinked with the drug cartels. And other companies like BAE and Nashua, which is a British company, but which is involved in every aspect of weapons production and weapons sales and pretty much anything you can imagine. And we're complicit in that, and we see that as a source of jobs, despite the fact that if that money, as Lou would probably advocate for, was invested in schools, was invested in health care, was invested in repairing our infrastructure, was invested in renewable energy sources, it would create more jobs and greater wealth, greater prosperity for us than spending the money on building weapons of war, which we hope never get used.
Yeah.
Right. You know.
Well, we got
Well put.
it could get us
Well
in this
put.
whole issue of the weapons of mass destruction, and as my good friend Kurt Smith said, either we get rid of these weapons or they're going to get
They're
rid of
going to
us.
get rid of us.
Right.
Now that was
That's
the
our
theme.
choice. It's really
Each-
very stark.
Oh, I
Right.
think that's
So each
true.
week
Sure.
of the Poor People's Campaign has a different theme. The theme of week 3 was this issue of militarism in the war economy. And we had a teach-in in the Hall of Flags at the State House led by veterans who came in and said, we're going to talk about the cost of war on people. We're going to talk about veterans, people who came back from Iraq and Afghanistan and committed suicide,
Yes.
whose names do not appear on the memorial wall in the Hall of Flags because they did not die in combat, but yet they are victims of war
Yeah.
and victims of militarism just the same.
Yeah.
We're going to talk about the $1.5 trillion or more that our government plans to spend on a new generation of nuclear weapons. We're going to talk about the way in which militarism destroys lives around the world. And people
Yeah.
said, we're going to talk about that until we're done. And at 5 o'clock, the authorities came in and said, you're done. And 6 people said, no, we're not. And they ended up getting arrested and taken up to the jail in Bosquen and charged with criminal trespass.
Well, I want-
for
I
trying
want-
to
I wanna-
teach about
I wanna-
militarism in the Hall of Flags.
I want to talk about that, but I want you to talk a little bit, if you can, about how Martin Luther King's last campaign, which was a poor people's campaign, it seemed to be cut off with his untimely death at
Yes.
an assassin's hand. How that came about to be revived here, and you can probably
Well-
tell us about other places as well. How is it that we're and I just think it's something to really celebrate for those of us that care about
Right.
good values in our country. How did this
Right,
come about
great,
to be?
Great. One quick thing to remember first is that he actually was killed in Memphis, where he was there to support black garbage collectors
Right.
who were on
That's right.
strike for the right to have a union.
Yep.
So the right to form a union, the right to collective bargaining is a fundamental element of economic rights. It was closely tied to the goals of the Poor People's Campaign 50 years ago, and it is part of the issues that we are lifting up now in the new Poor People's Campaign, which is also called a national call for moral revival. The idea kicked around for a number of years of what to do with this, and then with the leadership of Reverend Barber from North Carolina and Reverend Liz Thea Harris from the Cairo Center out of Union Theological in New York. That was really where the idea came. Built very much on the experiences that Reverend Barber had had with what we call the Moral Mondays movement in
Yes.
North Carolina, where over a number of years they've been bringing people to the state capitol building in Raleigh. That's where it is, right?
Yes, it is.
In North Carolina.
Yeah, that's right.
To demand to demonstrate for voting rights, to demonstrate for expansion of Medicaid, to demonstrate against the restrictions on the GLBT community that legislature was trying to impose there in North Carolina. We were doing similar things here in New Hampshire through our own movement that we call the New Hampshire Voices of Faith. And similar things like this were popping up around the country. So this time, again, with Reverend Barber and Reverend Thea Harris's leadership, the idea of a new Poor People's Campaign popped up, and the idea was unlike 50 years ago, where the idea was, let's get everybody to go to Washington. The idea was, let's focus on the states instead. That's where the change needs to take place.
Yeah, and I think that's a brilliant strategy because if the
I
change
agree.
doesn't take place in the states,
Yeah.
the change isn't going to take place, and it has to take place in the states. And I look at my time in politics. I've been in and out of the state legislature since 1972, and I can tell you, as you were here for most of my career, what it was like early on, and how we've moved. You know, we haven't moved very far, to be honest with you, but we've moved. And one of the things that has moved us is the power of the statewide newspaper has been dramatically reduced. And
There's a blessing.
yeah, and of course the negative side is the news. The news really isn't news anymore. You know, we just hear the same stuff repeated over and over again, and we get 2 points of view. But I think the fact that people within the state recognize what's going on is very important. And what I see is economic segregation has become pervasive in this state. Pervasive in this state. And one of your comments was about education. I served in our local school board. I've been a teacher for a long period of time. I think that's where we have really failed our kids. And that's, we won't invest in education. We won't invest in education. And it's the basis. You know, I talk on the Senate floor about the great thing about this nation is a free and appropriate public education for everybody.
Right.
And we can't get there.
Right. So this year, again, we were successful in beating back an
Yes.
effort to basically rob the public education
Right.
system through the voucher bill or the education
Yes.
freedom savings
Yes,
account. So
right.
that's a good thing.
Yep.
It wasn't stopped in the Senate. It was stopped in the House, but it was
stopped,
close.
It was
Yeah,
stopped in
it
the
was
House,
stopped in
but
the
again,
House.
it was a battle over
Yeah.
a couple of years, and
Yes.
it was finally people realized, including Republicans, and that's something that I
Yes.
think is important to
Yeah,
note,
right.
is that when our legislators, I'm an outsider when I go up there, and this is the way I
Yeah.
see it. When the legislators, regardless of party, are presented with people telling their own stories about what's going on and the impact of the policies, legislators are able to respond with
Yes.
compassion and with common sense. And I think the defeat of this voucher bill is an example of that. And that's something we're trying to do with the Poor People's Campaign, is make sure that the priority goes to the voices of the people who are most affected by this issue. If you want to learn about the lack of affordable housing, let's talk to people who have experienced homelessness. If we want to learn about the problems, our lack of prosperity, let's talk to people who are stuck in low-wage jobs in a state where the legislature, in its wisdom, abolished the minimum wage in 2011,
Yes.
and we've not been able to restore that
Right.
in 8 years.
Right,
Yeah.
right. We
Let's
haven't-
talk to people who are living with poisoned water in their communities because of the irresponsibility of chemical corporations in our midst,
Yeah.
and what that's like, and listen to them
Right.
to craft our ideas about what to do next.
Yeah, and very well put. We've made some strides there. This water fund, this trust that was established as a result of the suit. The state is moving forward to get better water.
Yeah.
You know, to get water to people, and that in holding the company responsible for their actions.
Right.
You know, to do that, but. In 1982, when I was running for governor, I talked about water and waste as key elements for our state. Water in particular,
Yeah.
because of our use of wells and the arsenic contained in our wells and the fact how high the levels were. It fell on deaf ears in 1982. But here we are in 2018, and it's all coming back.
Yeah.
So we've really got to do something. We've got to do something to make change. But I think the one thing that I have seen in all of my time in politics is the growth of that economic segregation. And I live in Manchester. I've been here a long, long time. And you see the periphery becoming the very wealthy areas, and the investment being made in those areas. The schools in Bedford, the schools in Wyndham, the schools in Amherst, schools in Durham, the schools in Hanover. But then you take a look at Berlin and Claremont,
Yeah.
and it's awful. It's terrible to think Berlin has the highest tax rate
Right.
in the state.
And is that the design?
Yeah.
It's the design of our tax system.
Yeah,
It guarantees that that's going to be the outcome.
well, it
So
plays a role. There's
it's
no
not
question.
it's not an accident
No, it isn't.
So we're ending up now in this period of time in which over the last generation we're seeing this widening gap
Yes.
between the rich and the poor,
Oh,
and the
absolutely.
disappearance or the threatened disappearance of the middle class.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
the economy is very productive, and most of the
But this
wealth is going to the people at the very top.
So
No
this is
question.
kind of a downer, the way this is going.
Well,
Where
Again,
is
let's-
where is the sunlight and the
Well,
break in the clouds? And
well, the sunlight does have to do with unleashing the power of the people through movements like the Poor People's Campaign or through other things that are going on. Even again, back for you legislators, look at the role of transgender people organizing, stepping forward this year, making sure that their stories and their experiences got heard by people at the legislature so that New Hampshire could pass a reasonable, common sense, compassionate bill to add gender identity to our state's human rights statute.
Yeah.
It didn't happen just because of well-intentioned legislators. It happened because the people who were most affected by that were able and willing to tell their stories and step up and organize
and
and
the
make
cynic,
sure
and the
that people
cynic in
couldn't
me
get away
says,
from it.
well, those people did a great job, but they had resources
They
to
did.
help them.
That's right.
The problem with poor people is that they don't have resources. And so, I mean, where does your campaign go? How do you take this campaign
It's rough,
to the
and
next level?
I will, and I'll acknowledge, the fact that you're talking to me
Nothing's
here
easy.
today. I am not a poor person. We all, so I am not talking from my own experience. And it would be better if we had people who were able to do that. We would all learn more. But we will have, if you show up at our rallies in front of the State House on the 6 weeks of the Poor People's Campaign, you will find that there are people there who are talking about things from their personal experience.
Right.
And that's how we're trying to move this forward, as well as people from the clergy, as well as others, music leaders, so that we're able to really convey the spirit of a people's movement as we go forward. And we see this as not we talk about 40 days of moral action from the middle of May till the end of June, but we all know that 40 days of action is not going to bring about the
Right.
kinds of changes that we need.
Right.
This is the beginning. Maybe
well,
it's always
the
the middle.
campaign to get the Martin Luther King holiday in New Hampshire shows that
20
you have
years.
to
Right.
you have
But
to
this
be
is-
ready for a long haul.
But this is happening all over the country right now. We're seeing, I think last week there were demonstrations, including acts of civil disobedience in 30 or 31 state capitals around the country.
Yeah.
So New Hampshire is part of it. We don't try to do things or think that we can do things all by ourselves. Sometimes we've got some distinct or unique challenges here, and perhaps we come up with some distinct or unique approaches in New Hampshire. But we're part of a larger meshed-in system. So when we talk about the systemic poverty, when we talk about systemic racism, we're not by ourselves in that either.
Right.
We are enmeshed in a much larger system, and we're not going to get out of it by ourselves either.
But people really make the difference. And what people do makes the difference. And, I've been very fortunate in my life, but I'll give you a quick story about my family, which, we account for in this book that I've just written. But we lived on the third floor of a 3-story house in East Boston. Person on the first floor was smoking, and he burnt the house down. Right? We lost everything. All of our clothes, all of my father's tools, everything. We were taken in by relatives, the movement of people. Each one, my mother at the time, we had 3 young boys, and we had an aunt living with us. We had the family, the old family thing. And I looked at the 1940 census to find out how many people were living in that apartment, and believe me, we were loaded.
A lot of them.
But people stepped up to the plate. And today, we have got to convince people that you can make the difference by stepping up to the plate. And if you do that, you make the society better. And I think we've lost some in our advancement, whatever. We've lost that spirit of helping, of caring, and as a result, many of the things that are happening in our society are as a direct result of people turning away and turning their heads. Can't do that, can't do that. And I think that's an example. It's a little one, it's a little teeny one, but it's an example of people helping people and saving their lives, making their lives better. And I can tell you that my mother, who was an industrial woman, she would take people off the street and feed them. And I'm telling you, we lived in East Boston, Massachusetts, And in those days, bag people used to come around with their little bags, house to house, selling stuff. And my mother would take them in and feed them. That's what I think the country's all about. And we've got to get back to that. We've got to get back to caring.
We've got some of that spirit. I mean, you know plenty of people who are
Yeah,
caring,
sure.
who will do that. But we're also in a situation in which, because of economic and technological change, we're more fragmented.
Yes.
You know,
Yeah.
our families we're not living with extended families
Right,
so
yeah.
much. And certainly, perhaps immigrant families are still.
Yes, I
But
think
others,
they are. Yeah.
others that much
Others
less
have
likely.
changed.
So we may not know our neighbors,
Yeah.
and that's
Well,
very sad.
sad.
Instead of relationships,
Yeah.
we're building fences.
Building fences,
And I can tell you that I've lived in my neighborhood for a long time. Everybody's got a fence except the Dulles Andrews. We don't have a fence. My wife gets perturbed at me. Oh, you're having this one over. You're having this one over. Well, that's how
That's
I
the way it
that's
is.
how
Good for
that's
you,
the way it
Lou.
is. That's
Good for you.
how I grew up.
That's right.
And she's great,
That's right.
obviously. But
That's
Yes, she is.
But I think that's what it's all about. We got to get back to that. We really do. And some of the elements of this society that were so strong.
Yeah.
You know, the church had such a presence at one time. That's dissipated.
Yeah.
I follow the payments, Arnie, of the church. Do you know how much money they've paid because of the sexual crimes?
Oh, it's got to be.
It's in the billions of dollars.
Yeah.
All that money could have been spent helping people.
That's right.
You
That's
know,
right,
and
yeah.
there's the crime.
There's
There-
another crime,
to me
another
that-
levels of crime.
yeah.
So again, we look
Yeah.
at the way our resources, again,
Yeah.
our resources go
Yeah.
to war, our resources go to the wealthy, and they're not going to repairing the damage that's been done in this society. So again, I think we're calling for, Dr. King called for radical redistribution. Dr. King called for significant change. And you know, how that's going to come about, I don't think we know exactly, Bob.
Right.
But it has to start with the voices of people. As our signs say, somebody's hurting my brother, and it's gone on far too long, and we're not going to be silent anymore. Again, that's one of the songs that we sing as
So,
part of the Poor People's Campaign.
As it says in the Bible, the question still remains, am I my brother's keeper?
And the answer is yes.
And the
Yes.
answer is
And the answer is
always,
absolutely
always,
yes,
always
That's
yes,
right.
and we
That's
just have to get back. I think it's very exciting to see the spirit of the young people involved in this, though. That's
Yeah.
something I think, oh, we have a call. I don't know if we got time.
All right.
Okay.
Let's see.
Which line, Paul?
No, Bob, there's no call there, sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Well, I
Had
was
a call.
thinking
fake.
we had a call, but we don't. And we're pretty much close to the end. Where does the Poor People's Campaign go from here?
Well, let me-
And if people want to participate, how do they
Well,
do
let me
it?
mention one thing is, of course, this being 2018, the way you find out about it is on the internet and on Facebook. So
Yeah.
if you go to
Right.
poorpeoplescampaign.org, that's the national website, but the first thing that will pop up is a sign-up form. And if you put in your name and your email address and a New Hampshire zip code, you'll start hearing from the New Hampshire Poor People's Campaign about upcoming events, including the next Nonviolent Moral Fusion Direct Action training that I'll be leading in Concord on Sunday for people who are interested in participating in civil disobedience actions in the campaign. You can also look for NH Poor People's Campaign on Facebook, and there you'll find photographs and videos from the actions we've been doing over the last 4 weeks and announcements of what's coming up. So that's something I would recommend. And some of the photos are mine, so I'm kind of proud of them. I want people to look at them.
Well, nobody better to train than you could be, Arnie. And just this program has flown by. It always does. And you've
Yeah.
been a wonderful guest, and you've given us a lot to think about. I wish we had more time. We'll have to talk about this again.
Do it again.
Because there's a lot more we could talk about here. But it's inspiring that we are, Americans, I think, are at heart, by and large, an idealistic people. And I'm hoping we show that the people are not happy with the way this country is diverted into militarism and racism. And we have an aberration at the top right now that I hope is not going to be too long there, but who knows. But we have wonderful people, and you're one of them, Arnie, and thank you
Bob.
for coming down and being part of us. And Lou, thank you for all you do, including being here
Yeah,
the
well,
first
thank-
Wednesday of the month, but it's a lot more than that. So I'll be back next time with Mark Farley. We'll have another edition of the Progress Report. We still have we have really an amazing field of candidates for the first congressional district.
Oh, I guess.
I mean, it's just amazing, these people. And I'm hoping we'll have some of them we haven't had on. We've had a good many. But some of the others you're going to really be interested in hearing. I'm hoping like Lincoln Soldati. He's a
Lincoln's a candidate.
really an
yeah.
amazing guy, you
Yeah,
know,
he
and
is.
others too. And we have Naomi. Well, I'm getting into it. I don't want to get into this here, but you know, these are people with good values, and so there's reason to be a good heart. Don't be
Well,
too discouraged.
we
Good
always-
people are doing things, including our good friend Arnie Alpert,
Right.
as he has for so many years.
Right.
So thanks
Great.
again. We'll see you next week, folks.
Great. Yeah, great to have you, Eddie. Really great.
It's really fun to have you here. Good.